So good evening, everybody. My name is Chantal Valran. I'm the Executive Director of Drug Free Kids Canada. I would like to thank the Northeastern Catholic District School Board, as well as the District School Board Ontario Northeast, for inviting us to present to your community today. This presentation on youth substance use is provided with the support of BMO Financial. I'd like to begin by acknowledging that my office is located in Ottawa, and it's on unceded, unsurrendered territory of the Anishinaabe Algonquin Nation. Today, each of the regions from which we gather are home to many Indigenous people, and we are grateful to have the opportunity to present on these lands. This webinar that we're going to be having tonight is one of the series, is one in a session that we're holding all across Northern Ontario. And the objective is to share knowledge and insight and foster collaboration. And one good example of this collaboration is the fact that we were invited by those wonderful people that the school districts that I was talking about. And as well, I also have the privilege and honor to be presenting with Steve Keller and Emma Schmidt from the YMCA Youth Cannabis Awareness Program tonight, who are going to be sharing knowledge on cannabis and youth, and also available to answer your questions. So without further ado, I would like to invite Steve. Just so you know, in terms of format, we're going to be presenting, we're going to be talking about facts and data about cannabis use, and have a little bit of quiz to make it a little bit more dynamic. I'm going to jump in after to talk about how do we all use this, make this relatable in a conversation with our kids. Some of you may be intimidated, some of you have maybe never talked about it. So how do we go about doing that? And then we will entertain any questions from the floor. If as we go through the presentation, you're like, oh, I really would want to know that, please put it on the chat. We'll just park it there and we'll see them, but don't worry, we'll leave plenty of time at the end to make sure that we have time to answer your questions. And then I will invite people from public health to present some of the resources that are available in your community. So Steve, do you want to start?
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Chantal. And thank you everyone for joining us tonight. As Chantal mentioned, my name is Steve Keller. I'm the curriculum developer of the YMCA's Youth Cannabis Awareness Program. And for the first little while, as you know, we will be discussing the sort of landscape of data surrounding cannabis use. Joining me as co-facilitator, I have Emma Schmitz. How are you, Emma?
I'm doing great, Steve. How are you?
Doing wonderful, thank you. We're gonna have a great time tonight. And so we're gonna jump right in. Really quickly, we like to take a moment to acknowledge where the data in this presentation has come from. There are significant amounts of national data that have been collected over the last about 7 or 8 years surrounding legalization and sort of the habits and behaviors of cannabis users. What we do is we looked at data from the Canadian Student Tobacco, Alcohol and Drug Survey, most recently been conducted in 2018-2019. There is new survey data that was posted for 2021-2022 that has yet to be released for the country, so we will have new data later this year. The Canadian Cannabis Survey most recently released their findings last month from 2022, as well as the National Cannabis Survey collecting data around legalization. I'm just sort of highlighting these. You don't have to worry too much about the small differences between each. It's just to make sure that you acknowledge there's a wide base of data that we had to pull this information from. And what matters the most is seeing the trends that you're going to find we identify that have emerged in substance use. We have the Canadian Alcohol and Drug Survey, the Canadian Post-Secondary Tobacco, Alcohol and Drug Survey, and finally the Canadian Perspective Survey series conducted during the COVID-19 pandemic. Now, like I said, we're going to be looking at trends. We want to make sure that we get the chance to sort of key in on what these have told us. And the first thing we've seen across multiple surveys is that the average age of initiation for cannabis use for youth comes in around age 14. Now, we know that different communities will report different numbers. We've seen communities in Northern Ontario where the age of initiation can be as low as 12 or 13 years old, and even cases where we've heard youth reporting cannabis use as young as 8, 9, even 10 years old. But this idea of 14 is fairly consistent across the country overall. This is also consistent with the national average of 13 and a half years of age for alcohol, and other surveys report first-time use at older ages for older audiences. In other words, young people are using cannabis today at a younger age than they did 10, 20, and 30 years ago. And that is why it's important for this sort of education to begin early on in life in order to be the most likely to stem or prevent cannabis or substance use in general. And this is why we encourage adults that are involved in youth lives to start the conversation about substance use before the age of initiation. It's never really too early to begin these conversations. Emma?
Perfect. So we're going to have a variety of different polls going on throughout the presentation. So first poll question, which demographic do you think reports the highest rate of cannabis use? Do you think
Sorry,
it's
that's the wrong one.
teens ages 15 to 19, young adults, adults aged 25 to 64, or seniors age 65 plus?
I see most of our surveys are saying young adults, a little bit of a split between everyone else. I'll close it down here in 3, 2, and 1. Poll is now closing.
All right, what's the answer, Steve?
Majority say young adults age 20 to 24. Would that be correct?
Let's take a look. It is absolutely correct. So I see that we have a very smart crowd here today. All right, so we're going to explore this a little bit more. So when we look at the CAT survey from 2019, what we found was that young people between the ages of 20 to 24, so kind of that post-secondary age range, did report the highest rate of cannabis use here in Canada. You can see that for ages 15 to 19, it's about 22. For ages 25 plus, it's down at 19%. But then when we get to that post-secondary age range, it's 45%, very, very close to 50%. What we see though as well is that although young people ages 15 to 19 and adults ages 25 plus are using cannabis less than that 20 to 24 age range, we find that youth ages 15 to 19 do have a higher prevalence of cannabis use than adults who are over the age of 25. Now, when we're looking at gender, what we find is that there is a prevalence that more males, people that are born biologically male, have more of a prevalence of using cannabis than those born biologically female. Similarly, when we're looking at the C-stats or the C-pads from 2020 to 2021, what we find is that cannabis use increases by age grade in Canada. You can see that in grade 7, it's about 2.4%. When people get up to grade 12, it's about 37.7%. And then after they graduate, when it goes to post-secondary, kind of beginning of the post-secondary years, it's very close to 45%. And then when people are in year 3 or more, so maybe they're finishing the end of their undergrad or starting a master's degree, more than 50% report using cannabis. All right, so moving on to our next poll question. Cannabis use amongst teens aged 12 to 17 was cut in half, decreased slightly, increased slightly, or doubled after legalization. All right, so we'll give a couple seconds.
We got about half the vote in so far, so we'll give them about another 3 seconds. We'll close it up in 3, 2, and 1. Poll is now closing. I see our majority say a slight increase, with some people saying doubled and a couple saying decreased slightly.
Absolutely, absolutely. All right. So those that chose C, increased slightly, are absolutely correct. All right, so when we're looking at past 12-month cannabis use by province, and this is going just kind of for that middle school age range all the way up to high school, what we can see is that, you know, depending on the province, it can look a little bit different, but on average, it is about 16.1% that did report using cannabis. And back in 2016, 2017, and then after legalization, it went up a little bit. We could see the most abrupt changes in British Columbia, where more youth reported using cannabis after legalization. And then you can actually see kind of some different trends, for example, in Nova Scotia, where youth used less cannabis after cannabis legalization. All right. So next, we're going to be talking about some factors that influence youth cannabis use. So we've got to keep the conversation balanced. That's a big part of our program. So there's a variety of different reasons why youth choose to use cannabis. Some of them you can see is for pleasure. They like the feeling, to experiment, to try something new, socialize. You know, maybe they're at a party or they're out with friends and it's a part of that socialization process. It could be to cope with different stresses in life, but also the medical uses. Now, because we got to keep it even, we also got to talk about reasons for non-use. And you'll see that a lot of these reasons for non-use almost mirror kind of those feelings as to why youth choose to use cannabis. So some reasons for non-use are fear of consequences. So maybe they're worried that they'll get in trouble with the law or with their parents. They understand that there can be negative effects to their body and mind. Maybe they're a little bit worried that they might get stigmatized if they do choose to use cannabis. Although stigma is starting to lessen with cannabis use in Canada, it still does exist. It could be their various opinions about substance use. Some youth have more positive opinions towards substance use than others. And for others, it could be just maybe a lack of interest. So they're just simply not interested in trying it out. Anything that you'd like to add, Steve?
You explained one thing really well, and I really like coming back to it. It's that idea that reasons for non-use and reasons for use do often mirror each other. When we look at social factors behind use, we know there's social factors behind non-use, and a lot of them come out of judgment. When we look at health-related uses for cannabis, some youth will say they use to help with stress or anxiety or depression, while others will say they don't use because they find cannabis causes anxiety or panic attacks or makes them feel more depressed. And we'll chat a little more about that towards the end. Now, our next poll question is: teens and young adults that use cannabis have reported blank during the COVID-19 pandemic. Are they using the same amount? Are they using less? Or are they using more? What does our audience think? A lot of the votes are in. We're going to shut her down there in 3, 2, and 1. Poll's now closing. Now, a significant percentage of our audience, about 10 out of 12 or 83%, are saying they see a report using more. Now, there's something really interesting that did happen in the data here, is that you are correct in that they are using more, but at first, early reporting data actually showed that overall cannabis consumption did not increase, it actually decreased, particularly among young people. Now, a lot of the factors for this had to do with the lack of availability of cannabis, the fact that prior to the COVID pandemic, youth may have been getting cannabis from each other, spending time socially in groups, but due to the lockdowns and the social distancing measures, they no longer had the ease of access that they used to. Now, these trends did not lead to a continuous decrease, as 1 year later, we saw that while 31% reported an increase in 2020, that number jumped to 46% in 2021. And while 38% reported a decrease in 2020, that number declined to 27%. In essence, we know that youth ages 16 to 24 reported a drastic change in consumption habits, trending towards increased use, and multiple research, including that from CMHA, CAMH, as well as the Canadian Cannabis Survey, estimated and stipulated that there was a strong likelihood that increased and continuous isolation and lockdown measures could have actually resulted in a continuous increase in increased cannabis use. Now, the reasons for increased cannabis consumption during the COVID-19 pandemic, I alluded to that idea of isolation, but the most common ones that we saw in a 3-year span from the CCS included boredom, stress, anxiety, relaxation, as well as a lack of a regular schedule. Individuals were also at risk for increased consumption if they also reported loneliness, concern about financial future, a worsening mental health, heavy episodic drinking or cannabis use already existing. For young adults, it was working in a job that increased the risk of contracting COVID-19. And for all ages, individuals that reported a lower level of education were also more likely to report increased substance use, particularly cannabis.
All right, so moving on to the next poll question. Do you think that cannabis is the first, second, third, or fourth most used substance by youth in Canada? Now, Steve, if you didn't know this content already, what do you think would have been the, what do you think cannabis would be? Do you think it'd be the most used substance? Do you think it'd be the second most used substance?
I would have put it second or third, and it looks like most of our audience has it at first or second.
Interesting, interesting.
So I see the results. We have about a third saying first, 58% saying second, and about 8% saying third. Emma?
All right, so let's take a look. So what we find through the research is that cannabis is the second most used substance by youth in Canada. We find that the first most used substance is actually alcohol, and that's for all age ranges. And then we see that tobacco is typically the third most used substance. Now, really what we want to highlight too with this slide is the idea that all substance use does increase as people get older. Now, when we're talking about using tobacco or alcohol in combination with cannabis, What we find is when we're looking at alcohol specifically, 26% report using it together rarely, 27% sometimes, 14% often or always. If you put all those numbers together, that's more than 50% of the respondents suggesting that they use alcohol and cannabis at some point or another. So that's why it's really important to suggest this or to talk about this, as there can be some risks associated with it. Now with tobacco, it's not as common as you can see in the statistics, but you know, it is something that's still happening. So it is important to talk about this. And what we also see from the different statistics is that the majority of Canadians, so 90% or more who do use cannabis, never combine cannabis with illegal opioids, prescription stimulants, sedatives, stimulants, or illegal hallucinogens. Is there anything else you'd like to add, Steve?
The one thing I would add is we know that about 2/3 of Canadians age 16 plus that use cannabis will mix it with alcohol, and the risks of mixing these two substances can be quite extreme in some cases. Increased use of both substances increases the risk of cannabis as well as alcohol poisoning. It does also significantly increase the risk of impaired driving and fatality as a result of impaired driving, as well as worsening symptoms of hangovers and burnout caused by dehydration. And in some cases, as we know, cannabis can act as an antiemetic and prevent nausea and vomiting. So if a person has actually consumed too much alcohol and needs to pass the alcohol through vomiting, if they've consumed cannabis, this can sometimes make this more difficult and result in a greater likelihood that that individual will require hospitalization to have their stomach pumped. Which of the following methods of cannabis consumption is the most popular in Canada? Is it eating? Is it dabbing, which is the use of cannabis extracts? Is it smoking, or is it vaporizing or vaping? What do we think? A lot of votes coming in on vaporizing, some for smoking, a couple there for dabbing. We'll close the poll up here in 3, 2, and 1. Poll is now closing. I see a slight advantage to smoking followed by vaporizing. We've got about 6 to 12 at smoking, 5 to 12 at vaping. Now, the number one response that we do actually see here is, in fact, smoking. But the second most can sometimes be a little surprising for people. For the longest time, actually, until this past year, smoking was the number one method of consumption across all age ranges, followed by edibles, followed by vaping. This past year was the first year that a national reporting data actually showed more youth reporting vaporizing cannabis than eating cannabis edibles. For young adults and adults over 25, edibles remains number 2, followed closely by vaping. And what's important to highlight here is that different methods of consumption can mean a person is using different levels of the active ingredients in cannabis, particularly THC and to a lesser extent CBD. And we know that products that have a higher amount of THC may cause greater psychoactive effects, especially in youth. And each method of consumption exposes the user to different risks, and understanding each method, its onset of effects, its peak and duration is important in reducing its harms. Our program actually has a workshop that explores this in greater depth. If you're curious, we do have a link we'll post at the end about that as well. Next poll question: legalization has resulted in more or fewer charges for youth for cannabis violations? We now have a legal framework for cannabis, whereas before it sort of existed under sort of drug-related offenses. Do we think we've seen more charges or fewer? Bit of a divide here. All right. So it looks like we've got just about all the votes in. I'm going to shut it down here. I see with a slight majority, we have more people saying more and fewer people saying fewer. The answer here is actually a little bit surprising. The answer is there have actually been fewer criminal charges for youth for cannabis-related violations since legalization. Now, between 2015 to 2019, the rate at which youth were charged for cannabis-related offenses actually decreased from about 58.7% in 2015. It increased over 60% in 2016, before decreasing all the way down to around 40% in 2019. Now, it's held consistently at about 41% in 2020 and 2021. And we know this has to do with the fact that since the Cannabis Act was passed, youth found in violation of the act are actually less likely to face criminal charges for cannabis-related offenses. They're more likely to be placed in diversion, community service programs, paying fines, with less of a focus on criminalizing, incarcerating, and giving a criminal record to an underage youth for things like misdemeanor possession. Now, in more serious situations, things like trafficking, selling significant cannabis or repeated cannabis violations, you may see incarceration or criminal records. but the rate of these happening has been decreasing. However, despite similar rates of use, our BIPOC communities do remain disproportionately stopped, searched, arrested, prosecuted, and incarcerated for cannabis possession. Emma?
All right. The next poll question. In roadside surveys taken across the various provinces between 2016 and 2018, more drivers aged 16 to 19 tested positive for A, cannabis, or B, alcohol.
Now, these roadside surveys, just so you're aware, they were over the course of 5 different provinces and territories. These actually included Ontario, Manitoba, British Columbia, Yukon, and the Northwest Territories. Looks like all of our votes in with a slight advantage to cannabis at 54% versus 46% saying alcohol. Emma?
For sure. All right, Steve, let's take a look. So it is in fact cannabis. So those that chose cannabis are absolutely correct.
Absolutely. The rate of cannabis was actually 5 times higher than alcohol over this 3-year span.
So kind of on the topic of driving, once again, what do you think was, which of the following reasons do you think was the most common reason provided by young people when asked why they drove after using cannabis? Do you think it's because they didn't have alternate transportation, they didn't feel impaired, they didn't think that they would get caught, they thought that they could drive safely, or they just simply didn't have far to go? So Steve, if you didn't know this content before, what do you think the answer would be?
Living in a small town, I probably would have said not having far to go, just based on the reality I see around me. What about you?
Honestly, like I grew up in Northside Edmonton, and honestly, I've heard all of these at some point in my teenage years. So none of these really surprised me. I don't know if I could pick one specifically.
Well, it looks like our audience shares that sentiment as we see answers right across the board. Some saying not impaired, some saying could get caught, some saying drive safely, some saying not have far to go. Emma?
For sure. So the answer actually is that they just didn't feel impaired. So it really kind of highlights the reason why it's, you know, important when you're having these conversations with young people to kind of talk about what impairment looks like. Now, when we're talking about being a passenger with a cannabis impaired driver, what we find is that young people between the ages of 16 to 19, we're about 5 times more likely to report being a passenger in a vehicle driven by someone under the influence of cannabis, especially if they as a passenger were also a cannabis user. Now, when we're talking about adults, ages 20 to 24, so that post-secondary age range, they're about 2.5 times more likely. So one thing that we really want to highlight, especially when you're having these conversations with youth, is really the importance of finding a safe, sober driver to be able to take them home if they're going out. We can see that youth tend to be, you know, at least they're appearing to be learning some of the risks associated with driving under the influence of cannabis. But even though they understand the risks of, you know, they themselves driving under the influence of cannabis, they might not necessarily understand why, you know, if they're driving or if they're riding in as a passenger while a friend is driving high, how that could potentially be harmful. So really important to really talk about that idea of planning safe transportation when you are having a conversation with young people.
You're absolutely right. Now, one thing we like to bring up is our presentations are designed to be neutral. We do point out risk and we do point out possible harms, but a lot of the data that we showed here, we tried to show in a neutral fashion because we don't want to say that all cannabis use is problematic. That doesn't really give justice to the subject, although saying it's never problematic is not correct either. We understand that cannabis use can become a problem when it begins to impact a person's life in a negative way. It's possible for cannabis use to become problematic, and we can explore that on the next slide, according to various sources, including the CCSA from this past year, examining the idea that no use at all avoids all risk. There are no negative effects or no potential risks if a person doesn't use substance. There's something to be said about abstinence in that idea. However, abstinence-only programming neglects the 20% of the population we know that uses cannabis. So it's important to be able to point out low-risk use, which is the idea of an individual setting limits when they use cannabis. Maybe they use recreationally, they designate a sober driver, and they do not mix cannabis with other substances. They may still see negative effects. They might say something they didn't intend to while impaired, they might slip and fall while impaired, or they might oversleep, but they're less likely to see significant risks versus an individual that uses every weekend or daily. An individual that may be experiencing problematic use could see an effect on their relationships, their school or work performance, as well as a loss of interest in the other activities or coping strategies that they would once use to deal with stress and anxiety. Here we would see more and increasing negative physical and psychological effects, compounded even further where we reach the point of dependency, where the use of cannabis feels less like a choice. Cannabis becomes a primary coping strategy, and the individual begins breaking laws or getting into trouble as a result of cannabis use. Now, when we actually talk about the negative effects or the negative signs, we can point these out on the next slide from various sources. But I do like to highlight that the spectrum is not a one-way street. People can hit dependency and find their way back to no use. People can spend their whole life in no use or use at low risk and stay there their whole lives. Some people may experience some problems and move to low risk. There's no one size fits all here. Now, when we look at the signs of problematic cannabis use, there's really four spectrums we have to look at here. First is the physical spectrum. This can be characterized by things like increased appetite, cravings for cannabis, unexplained fatigue, sleepiness, or general malaise, an increased risk of lung infections caused by cannabis smoke, such as dry cough and bronchitis. We also see the increased risk for what we know as cannabinoid hyperemesis syndrome, caused by chronic heavy use of high THC potency products. This can cause significant physical effects such as fever, creeping skin, sort of that feeling of constant itching or scratching, as well as significant and persistent vomiting caused by and dehydration caused by that excessive vomiting. Emotional signs of problematic use can include continuous poor performance at work, anxiety, increased interest in high excitement, low effort activities, or isolation. Behavioral signs, including increased conflict with family and friends, use while driving, spending more time or money than you could afford, or breaking laws related to cannabis. And finally, the psychological signs we see include impaired planning and judgment, impairment to brain development, which we'll get at a little bit more on the next slide, an inability to stop using cannabis or use as an escape, and increasing use over time to experience the same desired effects. Now, leading into this presentation, we were asked if we could speak as well briefly on the topic of cannabis and the brain. So I do have one slide here. Emma, do you kind of want to explain a little bit what we have here?
Absolutely. So these are a few of the various different health risks that can come from cannabis use as it does pertain to brain health. So some of the sources that we have seen report that people can be put at a higher risk of developing different psychological disorders and schizophrenia, especially if they're using high potency cannabis products very frequently, and they do have a family health history of these conditions. In terms of anxiety and depression, we know that anxiety can be tied to almost, the amount of cannabis that some people choose to use. There are some studies that do report people finding relief with very controlled small amounts of cannabis. But on the other end, if they're using very high potency, large amounts of cannabis, actually experiencing increased anxiety. With depression, there is a link showing that those that do use cannabis, it is more likely that they also experience depression. At this moment, we're not able to confirm if it's the cannabis that's causing the depression or if they're using cannabis because they're depressed, but there is that link that is known. For cannabis use disorder, we know that specifically young people, as their brains are still developing, are more prone to cannabis use disorder. And that almost ties in with that aspect of memory and attention, mainly because the brain is still developing. Realistically, those teen years are the prime time to really develop your skills to be able to pay attention and hold your memory for a variety of different things, such as academics. And we know that cannabis use can potentially negatively impact those aspects of the brain. One thing I want to highlight is that, we have all of these great points on that last slide, but I do invite you to check out our website. We do have some presentations and some fact sheets that are more specific on how cannabis impacts the developing brain, so that if you do want to learn more, those resources are there. Now, these are a few strategies to remember when you are speaking with youth. The first one is to educate yourself about cannabis use and misconceptions, because there are a lot of misconceptions out there. And as Steve was mentioning in the chat, and Jonathan as well, there are a lot of really great fact sheets on our YCAP website that can teach you a little bit more about the substance. The other is the idea to limit use or delay it altogether until turning 25. Make time to do other things that you enjoy. Having skills, competencies, and hobbies is definitely a protective factor. To avoid using cannabis, or you or your family has a history of mental health disorders. We talked about that a little bit earlier. To make sure to plan for transportation or designate a driver if you do plan to go out and use cannabis. And depending where you live, this is going to look very different. Maybe in a big urban city, there's buses, there's trains, there's taxis, Ubers. But in smaller communities, it could be that maybe you're getting a ride from a sober friend or a parent. If you choose to use cannabis looking for products with lower THC content, that in itself is a harm reduction tip. And the last one is to use in a safe place with people that you trust.
Absolutely. So the very last thing we're going to show you before I pass the microphone back over to our esteemed colleague Chantal is to discuss a little bit of risk and protective factors. We know that not all correlations are causal, and when we take a look at the idea of an individual being at risk or not at risk of using cannabis, there's no one way to guarantee a person will or will not have a problem. But we do know that risk and protective factors exist on multiple levels, including the community level, where we see an availability of cannabis and favorable laws, the school factor, where we see peer use of drugs, tobacco, and other substances, a negative school climate and a lack of engagement. The family factors that we see for risk include low parental monitoring, family conflict, and favorable attitudes towards cannabis. And the individual risk factors include childhood trauma, use of cannabis during adolescence or prior to the age of 15, and use as a coping mechanism. And finally, the protective factors we see include pro-social opportunities, clear and healthy standards for behavior and quality of peer bonding, quality of family bonding, as well as caregiver monitoring, as well as clear and healthy standards for behavior, resilient temperament, and competencies and skills. And I would like to thank you very, very much. I know we covered a lot of data here in the last 25 to 27-ish minutes. So I'm going to turn the floor over here to Chantal and pass along to discuss the conversations we had with youth.
Thank you, Steve. It is a lot of information, but I'm learning every time, so I appreciate it. And I can appreciate that parents and families in the community tonight are learning as well. And as I mentioned, if you have any questions, please put them in the chat, and we'll make sure that we take some time at the end to review them. So what I'm going to do for this part is really take this information and go, okay, so what do we do now, right? So the point is really to equip parents and trusted allies, anybody who plays an important role in a kid's life, to be able to engage in conversation with their kids, with their youth, about all of this great information that we had tonight. So I have some tips and tactics and some data for you to be able to hopefully use at home. So I'm going to share my screen. You know, I'm a mother myself. I have a 14 and a 17-year-old, and sometimes you wonder, really, is there a point? Are they even listening? Wouldn't it be, you know, more effective if they talk to their friends? Because apparently that's where they're finding their information. And interestingly, we do a tracking study with teens across Canada, with parents and teens. And we ask them specifically, who is your most reliable, trusted source of information when it comes to substance and substance use? And every time that we've asked these questions in the past tracking studies that we've done, and again, like this is to thousands of teens across Canada, the number one answer that comes back is that 67% of teens say parents are their preferred source of information on substance and substance use. And that's followed by school at 56%. And just for your information, friends come in at 26%. And as well, to put you at ease, you may be thinking, yeah, but then they're saying that because they know their parents are listening. They're not. These are confidential surveys. The parents don't know what the kids are answering. So I think that the important piece of information, and what we often share with parents, is that the important part here is we're saying, who's your reliable source of information? So when you do take the time to talk about substance and substance use with your kids, they know it's coming from a place of love. They know it's coming from a place of concern. Whereas maybe when they're talking with their friends, it could be coming from a place of peer pressure. Try it. I had it yesterday. It was fun. Kids will trust that their parents are sharing, you know, valuable information with them and trustworthy information with them. So keep at it. And when we ask parents, when they engage in those conversations with their teens, have they noticed a difference? 95% of them are saying that it did have a positive impact on their relationship with their kid and on the behavior with their kids. So we encourage parents to engage in those conversations, and I'm going to share with you some tips on how to go about doing it. And when we're saying that you do make a difference and you have an influence, I wanted to also address some of the questions. I'm anticipating some of the questions that may come later on. Often we're being asked, well, as a parent, should I provide my kid with alcohol to avoid them having to get alcohol from elsewhere? At least I'll know they're safe. When I'm talking about the influence, is that, you know, there's an idea that if they're going to drink anyway, isn't it safer for them to drink in my house? That's a valid point. But the idea that allowing kids to drink under your roof or giving them alcohol so that they avoid getting it from somewhere else is safer has not played out in the research. So just so you know, with Drug Free Kids Canada, we work with an advisory council that's made of PhD professors in psychology, in pediatric care, in social work. So we have access to a lot of research. And what the research and the studies is showing us is that kids that have kids whose access to alcohol has come from their parents have the same risks for harmful drinking as kids whose access comes from other sources. In addition, parental attitudes and permissiveness around drinking is associated with greater drinking harms. So research has also shown that teens who expect that their parents would talk with them or take away privileges if they were caught drinking were less likely to drink or drink less heavily. Right? So they may factor that into their choices. When they're out with their friends, they may think, well, maybe I shouldn't have more than 1 or 2 drinks because my parents will be concerned if I can't stand up straight when I get home. It actually becomes part of the consideration, right? And the point of us encouraging parents to have those conversations is to equip the kids with the best information, evidence-based, everything that we've talked about before, but as well as making sure that the kids have all of the right data and information and know the parents' expectations when they're about to make a decision. Because, you know, we're not going to be there when they're faced with making this decision. So we're hoping that by having those conversations often and early, hopefully that will help them make healthy and safe decisions for themselves. The last point I want to make about this is, you know, some parents may be using alcohol. And as Steve said, we share exactly the same philosophy. We're not here to judge. We're not an advocacy group for or against legalization. We're just here to support parents wherever they are in their journey. But some parents may be wondering, what is their usage? What kind of impact can it have on the kid? And there's significant research evidence that indicate that children of parents who use alcohol or cannabis are themselves most likely to use these substances. And there are several possible explanations for this relationship. It may be that when parents model alcohol or cannabis use, teens learn about these behavior and learn that they are acceptable and even positive. This is especially true if parents communicate to their teens that they use alcohol or cannabis to relax or cope, since teens look at their parents to provide them with tools and strategy for coping. This was seen in COVID, right? So all of a sudden, everybody's home, people are working from home, parents are stressed, parents are having a glass of wine at the end of the day. The glass of wine that typically would happen on a Friday, all of a sudden was happening every day, and would say, well, I just needed to relax. Even the acknowledgement, you know, there's nothing wrong with having a glass of wine, but even the acknowledgement to say to your kid, oh my God, like I just noticed that I've been using wine every day to just unwind. Maybe there's other ways of coping about it. Maybe why don't we go for a walk? Or maybe I'll have a bath tonight. Like acknowledging and allowing yourself to be vulnerable and authentic at this will also allow your kid to be the same way, right? So we're not expecting our kids to be perfect, and we're not expecting parents to be perfect. So the acknowledgement of maybe looking at my behavior and questioning myself will hopefully trigger the same behavior in your kids moving forward. So there's a lot different other studies that you can have access on our website that shows those that shows the impact that parenting modeling around substance use can have on your kids. If you have any questions at the end, I can answer that, but I also encourage you to come on our website and visit those studies. Casey, next slides, please. So how do we put it all together? So once you're ready and you think, okay, it's time to engage in those conversations. Again, I want to stress out the fact that it is an ongoing dialogue. This is not, we're going to have a talk and it's going to be Saturday at 7, we're going to sit down, we're going to have the drug talk. And then as a parent, I check it off and I said, I'm done. I don't need to do this anymore. This is very much about creating a space where this is a normal part of a conversation, like we would talk about everything else. Alcohol, cannabis are part of our life. As you know, legalization has happened. It can be a topic of conversation around the table. It doesn't mean that it needs to be this formal conversation where you're, you know, inquiring about usage. We can generally talk about substance use and build that trust so that hopefully your kids can come to us if they have questions. So what are some strategies that we can do to get that dialogue going? The first one is to stay educated, know the facts. So, you know, I applaud you for being here tonight. You being here tonight and learning about this is one great way of being educated. There's a lot of valuable websites as well. We have one of them, the YMCA has one of them, Health Canada. There's a lot of reliable sources out there for you to be educated. And what I'd also teach your kids is that, you know, you care enough to go and know about the facts. It's not about you sitting down and just sharing an opinion based on feelings. You certainly can have feelings and can be concerned, but if you're approaching it with curiosity as opposed to approaching it as a lecture and judgment, you're going to hopefully, you know, get respect from your kid, because they'll know that you're actually basing the conversation on some facts. And if you don't know it all, again, that's one of the things. Like maybe, you know, some people are intimidated because they say, I don't know much about this, or you know, I may be tricked into some questions that I have no idea what it is. Then it's okay to say that you don't know what it is, and it's okay to go together and find a reliable source of information to validate some of the questions and the beliefs that your kids are asking us. Set goals. So these goals can be different on the age of the youth, right? So you're going to have a different goal with talking with a kid in grade 5 than you would have a conversation with somebody who's in grade 12. So an example of goal, and this is a goal for yourselves, just so you stay focused and you know, and you don't get derailed with emotions or panic. But a goal might be to learn what your kid knows about cannabis and what they think about it, right? So being able to try to find out how much they know. THC, what does that mean? CBD, what, like, how do they all work? How do they think it works? And then being able to validate that. You as a parent, when you know this goal, is going to help you get the right tone in the conversation. Keep an open mind. At the end of the day, you may be surprised by what your kids know or what don't know. And it's about, you know, approaching it again with curiosity. If you've done your research before, you shouldn't be as intimidated, but, you know, go at it and ask open questions and being able to, you know, it's not a matter of saying, I'm going to tell them that I don't want them to do this, and that's the end of that, and then I'll never have to talk about it again. Because what's going to happen in those instances is kids are going to turn to other sources of information. In a vacuum, they'll find information elsewhere. And wouldn't you rather validate the information they know than for them to get it just anywhere? Don't lecture, engage. So a conversation is supposed to be 50-50, 50% of talking, 50% of listening. So, you know, get ready with some open questions, get them to talk to you about it. It's not easy, but, you know, think about the fact that you're trying to get them to feel at ease, to ask questions. So make sure that you're setting that right tone, so it's not just going through a list of things and then you're done. Find a comfortable setting, of course, like not, you know, if you're walking into their room and they're studying for a big exam and you're ready, you know, you got all ready for that talk and you think it's going to happen that night, respect the kid that the kid may not be in the best disposition to have this talk. So maybe this is not the right time, maybe this is not the right setting. We can talk about it some other time. And identify where on the continuum of use your kid is. Steve before was mentioning where they're at in terms of consumption. Are we talking about somebody who's never experimented? Are we talking about a kid who's actually using to manage anxiety? That's a completely different conversation. That's a completely set of different data. But the best way to approach it is, I'm your mom. I care about you, and I'd love for us to be able to talk about this. Is this a good time? So that's one way to get the ball going. Next slide, please. Age-appropriate conversations. So interestingly, again, some of the questions we often get asked is, how soon should I start? And people sometimes are surprised when, the first thing on my slide is toddlers. Like, what could I be possibly talking about when it comes to substance use with my toddler? It's all about building the foundation. It's all about building that conversation, that approach with your kids. So we know that, toddlers are determined and they're demanding, they're energetic, and they're so challenging. They have learned the use of no, and they're going to be using it a lot. Well, this is a great time to set stage for healthy habits, and that will stay with them as they grow. For example, when we're talking about substances, if your child takes a vitamin, that may look like a character, or that looks like a gummy bear, for example, they may be tempted to want more than one. Being able to right then establish that that is not a candy, to be able to explain that there's a difference between candy and medication, right? Even if it's a vitamin, but just to introduce that concept so that kids can be aware that there's some things that you can take that's going to make you feel good, but they're not meant to be candy, and they're already establishing that distinction. That's a great way to start that talk at that age when we're talking about toddler. When we're talking about preschool, 3 to 5 years old, these kids are confident, they're independent, they're fantasy driven, they're having tea parties, self-focus, they're highly emotional, they're asking a lot of why and how and why not. When you're engaged in conversation at that 3 or 5, focus on the health aspect of it. What do we do when we're healthy? What do we do when we're sick? Isn't it wonderful when we're healthy and we get to do all this, and when we're sick, we're not feeling that great? And that's, again, I was talking about vitamins before, but introduce again the fact that medicine can help you feel better when we're sick, but they can also hurt your tummy when you're overdoing it, or if you're taking it and you're not sick. Being able to start explaining this. At the same time, it's a great time to introduce the issue of responsibility. Ask your children to feed the pet every day or brush their teeth, and celebrate their good choices. So when they do, do something that they're supposed to be doing, celebrate that health-wise, right? That's great. You brush your teeth. Being able to celebrate those great moments that they're making healthy decisions for themselves. At the same time, show your child some dangerous cleaning products so that they're aware that they can hurt your body, right? So they understand that some of these products can be harmful, so they have a better appreciation of what in the house could actually be hurtful to them. Elementary school, 5 to 8 years old, they like routine, they love their family, they're still at that age. They love to learn, they don't like to fail, they don't like to lose face, and they love praises. So this is a great time to start introducing drugs like tobacco and alcohol, and getting them to understand that that those things are not good for their bodies, and it can cause children to be very sick. That's a great age at 5 to 8 years old. You can use some teachable moment on TV. If they're seeing a character they like, for example, in a movie, and that character is not making some great decisions, or it could actually be that they're seeing some people smoking or drinking too much. We could talk about that with them. What's going on? What do you think happened? Just being able to talk about ways of keeping our bodies healthy, right? It's that whole notion of making healthy decisions for yourself. And at this stage, at 5 to 8 years old, that introduction is usually enough. Unless they have some follow-up questions, of course, you can, your kids, so you can engage in those conversations. But if they don't ask anymore, that should be enough. Just go with that, and there's going to be more down the line anyways. So next slide, please. So now we're getting, just one, yeah. middle age, 9 to 12. So we're talking about tweens. They're independent, they're vulnerable, they're emotional, they're still self-absorbed, and they're inquisitive. And oh, that's an English word again that I'm having a hard time with, but you're seeing it on the screen. This is a time where you can be a little bit more focused, like focus on smoking, focus on alcohol and cannabis, as these are as we saw before, they're the first substances that the tweens will try. Get to know what they know about it. Where do they get that information? How do they know if it's reliable? Introduce that notion, again, that importance of knowing where your sources are, knowing who you can trust with that kind of information. You can communicate as a parent that you're concerned about substance use and be honest that, you don't have all the information, but you can say, maybe we can learn together. But this is a good age, 9 to 12, to be able to introduce those notions, ask them what they know, and find out more together. High school, 13 to 18. So this is a great time, again, to talk about alcohol, nicotine, cannabis. They're the most widely consumed substances by teens. Spend extra time discussing these substances. Spend extra time asking them what are their opinions about them. Why do they feel this way? Get to know what they know, what they've experimented with, and ask them if they're willing to talk to you about this. That's one of those things when I was talking about a comfortable setting and picking the right time. One of the strategies is to say, I'd love for us to talk about this. Is this a good time? And respect that it may not be. There's a refusal initial to say, I don't want to talk about it. Just keep at it. And being able to say, but it's still important for me to talk about it. So maybe not tonight, but I'll keep at it and we'll talk about it again. And this is also a good time to establish some codes for them to be safe. When we're talking about equipping them to making good decision and feel at ease to call on you if there's anything wrong, this is one of those times where if they go to a friend or they're somewhere at the park and they're not feeling okay, they're not feeling safe, again, they don't want to lose face, right? Like we've talked about the fact that, teens are still emotional, they're defiant, but they're independent and they don't want to lose face. So it could be as simple as saying, Mom, can you, I forgot my keys tonight. Can you leave the door unlocked? That could be a key. That could be a password for a parent to know, okay, things are not great. I'm going to go pick you up. And then as a parent, you take the blame, and the kid can say, my mom needed to pick me up. But establish those codes so that kids know that anytime they can call on you and you can go and either pick them up or arrange for them to have a safe ride. But that's a great time, teenagers, to talk about this and get to know their level of comfort and knowledge with substance use. We added college and university level. I'll go quickly on it, but just because your kids are leaving for college doesn't mean that all of a sudden your job is done, as you all know. But it's important to keep the conversation going about substance use because they're going to be faced with decisions and they're going to be exposed to things that maybe they weren't exposed at home. They will also be exposed to a level of stress and anxiety that maybe they weren't exposed at home. And this is why it's important to have established some talks about coping mechanism, about how do you, take care of your stress, how do you take care of your anxiety, and stay alert as a parent to possible mental health issues and encourage them to talk to you about them and to talk to you about how they're feeling and seeking the support that's available to them around them. You can also discuss the lower risk alcohol and cannabis guidelines with them. The Canadian Center on Substance Use and Addiction have some charts about what is safe, at what rate should you be consuming if you decide to consume so that it's less harmful to you or you're running less risk for your health. Next slide, please. So again, in an effort to provide some tips on how to engage in fruitful conversation, as I was saying, we encourage parents to not lecture and engage in conversation. So these are some of the tips to help with active listening, looking at timing, Exam time is not the greatest time. Also, when your kid comes home and if they're impaired, it's not the greatest time. Emotions may be running high. You want to address it right away. You just can't believe that they broke curfew and they're completely either drunk or high, and you're make sure they're safe, but it's certainly not the right time to talk about it. Wait until, you know, they're feeling better and you're feeling better, and then you can engage in those conversations. Encourage dialogue, as I mentioned. Use open-ended questions. What do you know about this? Where did you find this information? How did you feel about this? Summarize what you heard is a great way to convey to your kid that you're listening to them. So if I hear you correctly, you know, you've gone to this party and this happened, but summarize and then let them see that you have listened, but at the same time did I miss anything? Is there something that, you know, I forgot, or did I understand that correctly? Be sincere, stay positive, show empathy and compassion. These are all, you know, given things, of course, that it creates an environment to do active listening, but just for you to go through that checklist, because what happens often is the emotions will run high and then we will forget, you know, to just sit down, take a deep breath, and these people, you know, you're raising them. So yeah, to just be able to take a sit back, and if it doesn't work, you know, it's fine. You can take a break. You can say, okay, this is really not going the way that I wanted to. Why don't we take a break and why don't we revisit this in a day or two when we're both feeling better? And that's also showing some skills to your kids that, you know, maybe sometimes when emotions run high at their end, it's better to take a break and to resume later. Next slide, please. Okay, that's my last slide. And I just, again, in an effort to have some tips and to help you in engaging in those conversations that hopefully will be rich and not tinted with negativity or judgment. Some of the terms to try to avoid: but, should, bad, stupid, disapproved, and instead we would encourage you to use and, would like, harmful, unhealthy, concerned, worried. For example, I have some example of, you did well on your report card, but I know you can work even harder. Example, what you could say is, you did well on your report card and I know you can work even harder. You should stop smoking pot or weed. You should stop smoking weed. Instead is, I would like to talk about why you smoke weed. Can we talk about this together, right? So you're coming at it from you. This is important to you and you'd like to talk to them about it. Telling them that, you know, smoking weed or drinking too much is bad for them. Harmful. Like when I was talking about starting with age-appropriate conversation with toddlers and everything, it was all around making healthy choices. So it's not so much as a judgment call that it's bad, but it's harmful to you. Same thing with stupid and unhealthy. Same thing about saying, I disapprove of this, as opposed to, I'm concerned. I love you, I'm concerned, and I'd really like us to be able to talk about this. And talking about, you know, I'm so disappointed that you're making so many bad choices and bad decisions. You may be disappointed, but really you're worried about them. So being able to say, I'm worried about some of the behaviors that you've displayed as of lately. Can we talk about this? Again, in an openness to, can we talk about this now? But if not, we'll talk about it. We'll talk about it later. So these are some of the tips. We have a lot more on our website at drugfreekidscanada.org. There's lots of cheat sheets or whatever, and these are not meant to be scripts, of course. These are just support and guides to help you. But as we know, we don't have a manual book for each of our kid, and you are in the best position to know how to go about it and to know how to engage in those conversations with your kids. We're just there to provide some guide if you need some help and some data and information that Steve was sharing before. So I think that right now we're right on time to be able to open the floor to some questions. If there's no questions right now, that's totally okay. know that you can always come on our website, and we have a chat line that is open 24/7. That's monitored by healthcare specialists, mental health care specialists, and they can provide guidance and help one-on-one. We also have a phone line that you can call. If you're at the beginning of this journey and you don't really know where to start, you want to have some help on how to get going, they can help you. But as well as if you're somewhere else in your journey and you're very concerned about problematic use with your kid, and you want to validate that, and you want to also see what resources are available to you, please come to our website. I see that Jonathan has also, thank you, who provided the information for our website. So I will now ask Caden and Erica from Caden from the Porcupine Health Unit and Erica from Timiskaming Health Unit to present, as I've mentioned, some of the resources that are available in your community that you can turn to. So I will open the floor to you.
Thank you. Can you see my screen, my slides?
Yeah.
Excellent. Awesome. Thank you. I just want to start by saying thank you to Drug Free Kids Canada for putting on this webinar. Really great information for parents in our area, and it's just so great that we can have these conversations today. So thank you. My name is Erica Alterman. I'm a public health promoter with the Timiskaming Health Unit, and I'm co-presenting today with Caden Hardy, who is a health promoter with the Porcupine Health Unit. And before we get into the supports that our health units offer, we're just going to be sharing a few slides on a community-based prevention initiative that we're looking at called the Icelandic Prevention Model, also known as Planet Youth. So this model has been around for a while and has really caught the attention of communities around the globe. And in both Timmins and in Timiskaming District, we've been exploring it and looking at the feasibility of moving ahead with this approach in our areas. So again, we're very much at an exploratory phase, but we did just want to give you a quick look at it today. So as public health, we like to focus on upstream primary prevention approaches. So these are approaches that focus on addressing the root cause of the issue rather than focusing on the symptoms. So we're always asking, how can we prevent issues such as early substance use, for example, from occurring in the first place? So moving upstream requires a shift in the way that we think about substance use prevention. So shifting from more short-term, quick fix solutions to longer-term thinking. We go from seeing substance use as an individual's problem or fault to a community solution. And moving from the whole just say no approach to really thinking about what is the community's role in building supportive environments where youth are healthy and engaged and do not feel the need to turn to alcohol or drugs. And finally, a shift from seeing substance use as a rite of passage to thinking about how we can challenge those social norms. So to set the scene, in the 1990s, Iceland had some of the highest rates of teen substance use in Europe. And for many years leading up to this point, Iceland, like many other countries around the world, had been relying on traditional approaches to youth drug prevention, specifically school-based programs that warned kids about the dangers of drinking and drugs. But they found that these programs were not working effectively. So using research, they came up with a new approach. The Icelandic prevention model is a whole community approach that was developed as a way to prevent, delay, and reduce youth substance use in Iceland. Over time, this approach was shown to improve not only substance use outcomes, but it was having a positive effect on many other well-being indicators for youth, such as increased positive peer and family relationships, and higher participation in extracurricular activities, among many others. And at its core, it's really about working together as a community to build healthy community environments where youth and families are supported. So the approach recognizes that youth are not individual actors. They don't act within a vacuum. Their views and their behaviors are heavily influenced by their social environment. And they found that risk and protective factors within 4 domains were particularly important for predicting the likelihood of teens using substances. And we looked at these in the first presentation. So these include factors within the young person's home and family life, the influence of their peer group, their school, as well as how they spend their leisure time. So in Iceland, they asked high school students to complete a survey in schools every year. And this survey asked students about their substance use views and behaviors, and also questions related to those 4 domains, so questions about their environment. And their analysis of these surveys revealed really clear differences between the lives of kids who took up drinking, smoking, and other drugs and kept doing so, and those who didn't. And in Iceland, a few factors emerged as very strongly protective, and some of these are participation in organized activities such as sports several times a week, total time spent with parents during the week, feeling cared about at school, and not being outdoors late in the evenings. So those were some of the big ones for their country. Iceland then looked to this data to decide on interventions to address risk factors and, more importantly, strengthen protective factors. So for example, creating supportive environments can look like increasing access to affordable, high quality recreational activities, after school clubs and programming, positive parenting, having caring allies in schools and in the wider community, and having clear and consistent expectations, boundaries, and promoting open communication with young people. And these are just a few examples. And Kaden, I'll pass it over to you now.
Thanks, Erica. So using the Planet Youth approach, Iceland saw some really astounding results. And over about a 15-year period, they went from having the highest teen substance use rates in Europe to the lowest. So the graphic on screen shows the trends over time from 1997 to 2022. So you can really see that drastic downward trends for being drunk in the past 30 days, daily smoking, and lifetime cannabis use. At the same time spent with parents and participation in sports went way up. So this is a really great example of protective factors in action and how things like spending more time with family and being able to access those high quality organized activities can correlate to decreased substance use over time. So these changes are significant, but we can see here that it has taken Iceland 20 years to get to where they are now. And due to the success of this approach, the model is now being used all over the world, including several communities in Canada and the United States. So to quickly wrap up the Icelandic prevention model, it's important to remember that this is not just about drug prevention, but rather it's about building communities where youth can thrive. So the focus is really on shifting the social environment that children and youth are growing up in. And we do this by first understanding what factors are making our local youth more or less likely to use substances through the annual surveys that Erica was mentioning. And then we can really get to work as a community to develop or strengthen activities that address those risk and protective factors. So for example, that might look like creating more after school programming for youth. But in the end, it is really a very collaborative effort. We all have a role in preventing substance use among youth, whether you're a policymaker, service provider, coach, a parent. It's important for all of these people to be around the table to make use of the survey data so that we can decide how we can take action to make sure our communities are good places for youth to grow up. So by focusing on understanding and addressing these risk and protective factors, problems like early substance use can be prevented before they arise. So this approach works, it addresses root causes, and when youth and families are doing well, then the entire community is better off. So that's all we're going to be sharing with you today on the Icelandic model, but of course there's a lot more information available. So we're very much, again, like Erica said, in an exploratory phase with this model. In Timmins, we're going to be moving forward very soon with it. So you may be seeing some more information about this. If you want to have an active role or if you just want to stay in the loop, please reach out to us. So we have put together an interactive online resource that has some information you can explore on your own. And there's also a form at the bottom of that site where you can that you can use to contact Erica or myself. So Erica just added the link in chat. Now moving on to supports and services in the community. The Timiskaming and the Porcupine health units are totally separate health units, but we do collaborate often because we share many of the same school boards. We offer very similar services in both of our districts. More than that, our managers at each of our health units meet regularly with school boards to discuss health promotion priorities in schools, and then they plan how we can best work together to support the health of students. So for example, we have public health nurses who work directly with adult allies or students in high school on youth wellness initiatives. So the topics are generally determined by the students. So the focus for these projects could be on healthy eating, vaping, anti-bullying, among others, whatever the priority is in the school at that time. So with support from the health unit and other adult allies in the schools, a group of students are engaged and empowered to plan and carry out health promotion activities within their schools or their communities to improve outcomes for themselves and their peers. So as you see on the image on the slide, that's an example of an activity at a local high school called Leave Your Mark. So it encourages students to leave their mark on a wall with a drawing, words of wisdom, a poem, or any other type of art. So this allows students to feel connected to their environment and to challenge the stigma around mental health. But this is just one example of a project students did. Our health units also provide harm reduction services. So there's free naloxone to those who use substances and their friends and family members in all offices. We also operate harm reduction clinics in all of our offices. We offer harm reduction teaching and free supplies to people who use drugs to reduce the risk of HIV transmission and any other bloodborne infections, as well as connecting clients to other supports and services if needed. So individuals who use substances can also dispose of sharps at our health unit offices in the big yellow sharp disposal bins, but we also support community partners and provide them with support supplies and naloxone for their own clients. Finally, our health unit offers free and confidential sexual health services, STI testing, pregnancy testing, etc. And this is open to anyone who needs it. So we will be sharing a list of helpful links and resources about the services that we talked about today. With that, please don't hesitate to reach out to us if you have any questions, and we won't keep you any longer, so thank you very much.
Thank you so much for this. It's so important for us to be able to collaborate with you guys on the ground and being able to share that information with the community so that they know what's available and all the wonderful work that you guys are doing. So thank you for taking the time tonight to be able to come and to share all of the resources that are available. That's extremely helpful. So that's all we had for tonight, unless there's some last minute questions. I don't see any in the Q&A. As I mentioned, everyone is welcome to come on our website. We have the Parent Support Hub where they can talk to a mental health care specialist and get answers to any of the concerns that they have. I want to thank you again, Steve, Emma, Erica, and Caden for sharing your knowledge today and your expertise. It is so valuable. Thank you. I also want to thank again the Northeastern Catholic District School Board, as well as the District School Ontario Northeast, for inviting us into your community tonight and being able to collaborate together. Thank you, everybody. Before you leave, there will be a survey, quick survey. It really helps us to enhance our presentations and being able to bring data that's valuable to everybody. So if you could just take 2 minutes and answer those questions, it's going to be very helpful to them. Thank you so much, everyone, and have a good night.